Hello there, welcome to the Saroid channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and all the better for you joining me today for part 3 of our story. And what an amazing story this is. We have a woman called Avril who is a writer, and she lives in Toronto, and she's got writer's block. She gets distracted every time she writes, and so she had her mother suggesting that she took up a friend's cabin in the middle of the Alberta countryside in a remote part of the world where she might get some inspiration for her books. And she's taking her 2 children along, and on the journey one of her daughters needs to get out of the car to go pee-pee. And when she does that, she finds a strange doll in a puddle and claims to have seen a bear man. But they just think their sister is, well, Avril thinks her daughter is perhaps a little dreamy, and of course her brother thinks she's crazy. But they go off to stay at this cabin. So let's find out where this story leads. I've got a feeling the doll and the bear man are most definitely connected. So before we start with our story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 3 of our story tonight. Avril had happily begun to take regular walks in the woodgrove with her devoted golden Labrador Jellicoe at her side, who seemed to be appreciating their energetic outdoor pursuits as much as Avril was. Being here in the Alberta countryside, surrounded by the spectacular charms, wonders, and marvels of the natural world, had really helped Avril come alive. Avril began to feel that an idea for an adventurous, thrilling story was beginning to brew in her mind. But it would be in the days to follow to see where the story would ultimately lead, as the scaffolding began to form. At least the obstinate feeling of staring at an empty computer screen had long since receded, almost as if her writer's block was now drifting away, like the faint, foggy white smoke from a chimney on a cold winter's evening. Avril had been heartily relieved to see that Hilda had cleaned up the doll that Laurie insisted on keeping, and there had been moments when Avril could have thrown the doll away, but something stopped her from doing just that, not only because her daughter loved the doll so much, but because a little voice in her head told her not to do it. One morning Avril was absent-mindedly looking at the doll that Laurie had found, for it was lying there on the top of the table. She studied it for a moment and realized that it didn't look half so bad now that it was clean, but it certainly looked extremely old. Hilda was making some tea at the kettle and began to look at Avril soberly. "Penny for your thoughts, Avril," she said. "Well, I was just thinking how strange it is that my daughter Laurie stumbled across this doll in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was lying in a puddle in the middle of the road, would you believe? On a sequestered country road at that. All I can say is thank you so much, Hilda, for cleaning it up. Well, the doll looks so much better, almost respectable. It's very old, though. I mean, it looks as if it is quite dated, actually." "Well, it was no problem to clean it up. It was quite easy to do, actually," said Hilda. "But you're right. The doll is old. It's a relic from the 80s, I suspect. I want to show you something, Avril, if I may. It really made every hair on my head stand up on end." "You've got me intrigued," said Avril, sitting down very suddenly at the breakfast nook to enjoy a cup of coffee that Hilda presented her with. She could see her 2 children were outside throwing a ball for Jellicoe. Avril watched as Hilda pulled out a piece of newspaper from her purse. "Look at this," she said, handing the newspaper article to Avril. In the newspaper article was a very large photograph of a little girl carrying in her hand a doll that looked almost identical to the one that Laurie had found on the road. The young girl was smiling into the camera and missing her 2 front teeth. Her blonde hair was tied back in 2 pigtails, and she was wearing a pretty white dress covered in little red poppies. She was a pretty little thing with big blue eyes, and Avril got chills when she realized that the girl in the picture could have been a double-ganger for Laurie. The resemblance between the two girls was remarkable. "Good grief," said Avril, unable to hide her surprise. "This doll looks the same as Laurie's, does it not? Even the clothes are identical. And the girl in the picture could so easily be Laurie. They're like doppelgangers, don't you think? You don't suppose the same doll that belonged to this little girl could be the one that Laurie found on the road? But goodness gracious, look at the date on this newspaper. It was printed in 1982. And look at the headline. 6-year-old Hayley MacDonald goes missing. Suspect now in police custody." "You're right. This happened in the 80s, Avril. This little girl, who looks exactly like your daughter, went missing from her home in Canmore, in 1982 to be exact," said Hilda. "I know the case well, because I live in Canmore, and my grandparents knew the MacDonalds, so they have an inside scoop on the story, you could say." "So what exactly happened to this lovely little girl in the picture?" asked Avril, a frown now creasing her forehead. "Was she ever found? They say a suspect was in custody." "No, sadly she was never found. But foul play was definitely suspected, and Hayley's uncle was considered to be the perpetrator of this abduction that happened in broad daylight, would you believe? The uncle was taken into custody and admitted to harming little Hayley. He even took the police to her gravesite, where he claimed to have put her body in a shallow grave under a whole bunch of leaves. But when the police investigated the area and looked at the grave, there was no sign of the little girl. Hayley's uncle confessed to the crime. He went to prison for life, you know, and believe it or not, he hung himself in a prison cell, and he left a note of apology to his sister, saying he was very sorry for what he'd done to little Hayley. In the note he said a demon inside him had made him do this terrible thing to her child, and he begged his sister for her forgiveness, claiming he was a very sick man in his head. I believe when the police took him in for questioning, he told them that there was a monster inside him that made him want to abuse children. He even told the judge that he was a sexual predator that should be kept in prison for life, and he even asked the authorities if they would consider castrating him, but they refused to oblige his request. He really was sorry for what he did." "Goodness gracious me! What a horrifying story! I can't bear stories about children being abused so needlessly. So how did Hayley go missing exactly?" asked Avril. Her curiosity was now standing up on stalks, and if her creative juices had been stifled for a while, this little story was making the dormant imagination inside her rise up from its slumber. Who would have thought a doll her girl had found in the middle of the road would have opened up a whole can of worms like this? "Well," said Hilda, "if you read the article more clearly, it says that little Hayley was out on the street, playing on her bicycle with her doll, who she took with her everywhere she went. The same doll as little Laurie has. The doll is even mentioned in the article. And would you believe she called the doll Annabelle, just like Laurie does?" "Oh, my word! I don't know what to say to that. How extraordinary! Because Laurie, as you say, calls her doll Annabelle." Avril's blood ran cold. "And this missing girl called her doll Annabelle as well. That's so creepy, don't you think? How does my daughter get to find a missing doll from the 1980s, if indeed it is the same doll, in a pool of water in the middle of the road? And then she chooses to call the doll Annabelle. I mean, I just don't believe in coincidences like this, do you?" "No, I can't say I do," said Hilda. "But what else can it be? It's got to be a coincidence, Avril. But I'm convinced it's exactly the same doll. Look in the picture. It's wearing the same dress, is it not? Everything looks the same." "This is creeping me out significantly," said Avril. "I don't understand how this doll can still be in such good condition after all these long years. And why on earth does my daughter get to find it in the middle of the road and then become so obsessed over the doll? I mean, honestly, I've never seen her like this over any other doll she's ever owned. And it's not as if Annabelle is particularly pretty. In fact, she's very dated looking. She calls it exactly the same name as this girl did. It's more than a little weird, don't you think? So tell me, Hilda, did the MacDonalds, did Mrs. MacDonalds to be exact, did she think her brother was behind the abduction of her daughter? Oh, she definitely expected her brother was behind her daughter's abduction. She'd noticed his behaviour towards little Haley for quite some time, if you know what I mean. She knew there was something insidious about it all. No, I don't know what you mean, Hilda. Why don't you spell it out, dear? Well, he was always looking at Haley inappropriately, if you know what I mean. And then he started buying Haley all kinds of gifts and sweets. And Mrs. MacDonald, she got extremely worried by his excessive attention towards her daughter, as let's just say her brother showed no interest in his nephew at all, and seemed to ignore him all the time. I understand Simon, who was Haley's older brother by 2 years, was most put out by his sister being showered magnanimously with gifts from his uncle, while he got nothing. I think he felt very hurt that his uncle discluded him in everything, and unfairly favoured his little sister. Mrs. MacDonald was exceedingly worried about her brother Victor's unorthodox behaviour towards her daughter, which was not natural. She warned Haley not to ever be alone with Uncle Victor, because he could not be trusted. Mrs. MacDonald also informed the police that when growing up as a girl, she vividly recalled her brother Victor's unnatural, unhealthy obsession with young girls between the ages of 4 and 8, which was perverse, she believed. Her parents believed this was true, and so they also referred their son Victor for counselling. Not that it helped, of course. Mrs. MacDonald told little Haley to stay away from Uncle Victor, and when she did this, her daughter's reaction was to become very upset, claiming that Uncle Victor was always so nice to her and had given her so many lovely gifts, so she couldn't comprehend why her parents didn't like her uncle. Mrs. MacDonald instinctively knew that Victor was grooming her little girl. She told Victor in no uncertain terms to stay the hell away from little Haley, and if he so much as laid a finger on her daughter, she'd go straight to the police and have him arrested. She believed her warnings to her brother Victor had worked a treat, for she hadn't heard so much as a beep out of Uncle Victor in many months, even though he lived in this run-down old shack about 10 minutes away from the family home, and had become a bit of a recluse. Mrs. MacDonald began to relax, feeling as if her brother Victor no longer imposed a threat towards her daughter Haley, because he'd kept to his promise and stayed away from her girl. "Oh, dear me," said Avril. "So Mrs. MacDonald's just got a little complacent, it would seem, not realising that her brother's interest in little Haley had not really faded away, as she believed it obviously had." "That's it, Avril. I do think she got complacent. She must have cursed herself for that," Hilda admitted. "On the day Haley went missing, Haley was playing outside the MacDonald house on her pretty pink bike with her brother Simon, and she had her doll Annabelle with her, of course. Simon went outside for a brief moment to get a glass of orange cordial, because he claimed he was thirsty, and when he returned to resume riding his bicycle, with his sister, she had all but vanished. His sister's pink bicycle was abandoned, found lying on the side of the road, outside the family home. Mrs. MacDonald drove instinctively straight over to her brother Victor's house, believing at once that he must have abducted her daughter. But the dishevelled run-down house he lived in was all but locked up, and his car appeared to be missing. The police later questioned Uncle Victor at great length about the disappearance of little Haley. It would seem a couple of young 6-year-old girls that lived in the Canmore area claimed that Haley's uncle had given them sweets and tried to give them a ride in his clapped-out old car to get ice cream on one occasion. But Haley's uncle had run away the moments the kids' parents had seen a stranger talking to their girls, and had told their children to come back into the house at once. Those parents did not know how lucky they were to have their eye on the ball, as in a place like Canmore, you wouldn't expect something like this to happen. Someone picking up your daughter like that, because the predators looming around usually were not of the human kind. When the police searched Victor's house, they discovered pictures of little Hayley blown up all over the walls of his bedroom, done in huge collages. When Mrs. MacDonald's observed the extent of Victor's depravity towards her daughter Hayley, it had made her skin crawl. The police claimed they'd never witnessed someone with such an obsessed perversion towards a little girl. So even before they cross-examined Victor, they already knew they had their man. Mrs. MacDonald's confessed that had the police not taken her brother Victor into custody, she'd have put a bullet through his head herself and be damned with the consequences of her actions, for in that moment she hated her brother Victor more than anybody else in the world. Even her own parents wanted to kill their son because he'd harmed their beloved granddaughter. Mrs. MacDonald's mother, Mrs. Periwinkle, said, "I always knew Victor had problems with little girls, and it concerned me greatly. I went to the police about it many times, But he'd never done anything to harm a child. So, of course, nothing was done about it. I gave him counselling and stuff like that, but none of it helped. My son was definitely sick in the head, rather deranged, but never in my wildest dreams did I ever envisage he would harm his own niece. It's absolutely abhorrent what he did." Everyone pretty much knew Hayley wasn't alive, and Victor, of course, confessed to what he'd done. But when he took the police to see Hayley's shallow grave, it had all but been emptied, and even Victor seemed surprised by this. They never did find the body of little Hayley, but some claimed that because the grave was so shallow, only covered with a scattering of leaves, a wild animal had probably taken her body away, and as she was such a small child, moving her body would have been relatively easy for a coyote, or something like that. "Oh, what a dreadfully sad story," said Avril. "Very sad indeed. So what happened to the MacDonalds after all of this? I can't imagine what poor Mrs. MacDonald went through losing a daughter. It must have been too dreadful for her. Did they move away from Canmore? I guess if it had been me, that's what I would have done. You don't want to wake up every morning and be brutally reminded of your dreadful loss, do you?" "Yes, they did move away as it happens. Both the MacDonalds and the Periwinkles returned to Scotland and settled down in the town of Edinburgh. I understand she went on to have over 6 more children, Mrs. MacDonald's, I mean. But I don't think she ever got over the loss of little Hayley. But I'm pretty sure the doll your daughter found is Hayley's." "Well, if that's the case, and the doll really did belong to Hayley, who is long since deceased, shouldn't I hand the doll over to the police? I mean, it's a relic from the 80s, is it not? And goodness knows why it was found on a country road of all things by my daughter." "But what would you say to the police?" asked Hilda. "That your daughter found an old doll that might have belonged to a girl that was abducted and killed in the early 80s by a man who's now deceased? I'm quite sure they won't be remotely interested. Besides, it might not even be the little girl's doll, although I do believe it is. But that's my personal opinion. But the fact that it looks identical to the doll in the photograph means absolutely nothing. I mean, think about it. They probably produced hundreds of these dolls at the time." "I hadn't thought of it like that, Hilda. You make a very good point," said Avril. "Thank you for sharing this astonishing story with me. I've been needing some inspiration for my writing, and this story has landed in my lap like manna from heaven. And I've already got some new ideas as to what to write about. Who would have thought a doll that my daughter picked up on the road on a rainy day would end up, well, inspiring me of all things?" "Well, I'm very glad that at least some good can come out of Hayley's tragedy," said Hilda reflectively. "I can't wait to read your next book, Avril. I know it's going to be brilliant. Oh, by the way, I was wondering, I hope you don't mind if I take the kids for a picnic in the Woodgrove. I hope I have your permission to do so. I mean, I'll make sure we stick to the path, of course. You walk Jellicoe there every morning, don't you? And I think during the daytime, the Woodgrove is pretty safe. But I'll take some bear spray with me just to be sure. But as far as I'm concerned, we don't have any problems with bears around here." Well, if there are any bears around and they smell your picnic, my advice to you would be to leave the food and evacuate the woods at once, and the bears would go straight to the food and leave you the hell alone, if that were to happen. But that is unlikely, because let's just say on my walks, I've never encountered any signs of bears being anywhere around here. That's exactly what I was thinking, and yes, that's what I would do, said Hilda. Good girl. Then of course you can take the kids for a picnic. It's a lovely idea, and my children adore picnics. Besides, it's so magnificent in the Woodgrove. I'm sure they'd love it there. Good, it's settled then, said Hilda, looking pleased. Laurie's account. I was only 6 years old when me, my mother Avril, and my brother Sam went to stay at the Birchwoods cabin, close to the town of Canmore. I am 20 years old now, but when it comes to my young life, I barely remember much about those early years, and yet I remember my trip to the Birchwoods cabin as a 6-year-old girl with a vibrant, crystal-clear clarity, as if those unorthodox events happened only yesterday. Maybe there are some memories that hang deep in your recall, leaving an indelible imprint like a scar on your skin that can never ever be erased. I may still be relatively young now, but I know I will take these memories of mine that I have as a 6-year-old girl straight down to the grave with me. Growing up, I had huge problems with my bladder that always wanted to inappropriately misbehave at the most inopportune times. And let's just say it would make my mother as mad as a March hare, as on every single road trip without exception, I always seemed to need to stop and to hold up the entire family in order to answer a call of nature. It was raining hard on the day we were trying to locate the mysterious whereabouts of the Birchwood cabin, which really was for us like looking for a needle in a haystack. Everything was so badly marked, and the undulating scenery and tall lofty trees often obscured some of those side roads. I recall I was exceedingly upset we were leaving Toronto behind for 6 long weeks to live in the countryside. I didn't want to miss out on kindergarten and time spent with my friends, nor did I want to leave my father behind. My mother said she was struggling to be creative at home, as far as writing her book was concerned, and her publisher was hard on her back, demanding to know what her next story was about. My mother had been fobbing her off with all kinds of tall stories. I do know that our next-door neighbour, Mrs. Sanders, would disturb my mother tirelessly every day, claiming to be searching for her cat, Bo Peep, that seemed to be forever going walkabout. I guess my mother felt that there was no peace in our household with so many distractions and interruptions, so getting away would help her focus more on the book she intended to write. On this agonizingly long road trip, which had laboriously lasted over 5 tiresome days, with various stops at bed and breakfasts along the way, I suddenly realized I couldn't hold my bladder for a second longer. My mother was not remotely impressed by this, as 2 hours earlier we'd stopped at a gas station, and I had told my mother then and there that I really didn't need to go. Now I was insisting that we had to stop at once. My mother knew she couldn't refuse my urgent request, because she had little faith in the reliability of my bladder. Let's just say I'd once relieved myself all over her back seat, leaving a stench for weeks that refused to abate. My mother was so embarrassed by the smell in her car that I'd left behind, that she blamed it on our golden Labrador Jellicoe, who had never peed on anything in the house or car a day in his life. My mother stopped her car and told me to be quick about it. I could tell by her indignant tone of voice that stopping for me was a huge hindrance and big annoyance. I remember climbing out of the car in the pouring rain and being unable to hold my bladder a second longer. So in the middle of the road in front of my mother's Hyundai, I had pulled down my pants and made quite a spectacle of myself. When I had finished with my business, that was when I saw the bear man. At that young, impressionable age, I had no way of knowing that the creature I was actually seeing was a 9-foot-tall male Bigfoot, and I only realized that many years later. I described him to my mother as a bear man because he was covered in long flowing dark hair and looked rather like a black bear. Powerfully built, I mean, but at the same time he was also a man with distinctive humanoid features and a very human face that reminded me rather of an Indian warrior. I remember being incredibly delighted to see the bear man, with the same kind of enthusiastic joy I would have been to see Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck. As for me, the bear man was like one of my favourite children's storybook characters, which was why on the road I waved at him madly and skipped ebulliently, as if I'd reconnected with a long-lost old friend that I hadn't seen for a long while. My unorthodox behaviour would leave my mother and brother rather perturbed, when later they asked me who I'd been waving at, and when I told them it was the bear man, they thought I was making up wild, fanciful, fictitious stories, and I let them believe that, because it was just too much to explain who the bear man actually was. He had been standing there behind the tree and looking at me through dark, very kind eyes. I remember even though he was a distance away from our car, I could sense his great kindness. I knew he was massive and very intimidating in size, but that did not scare me at all. I was standing in the rain, and the deluge was causing the water to trickle down my cheeks, to sting my eyes, and saturated my clothes, so in no time at all the pretty flowery dress that I was wearing at the time was clinging to me like a rag, almost as if I'd just dived into a swimming pool and succeeded in getting sopping wet. I could hear the bear man talk to me in my head. I didn't find that remotely odd, that I was experiencing some kind of telepathic exchange with him. It seemed for me the most natural thing in the world for him to be talking to me in this rather unusual manner. For when you're 6 years old, the world of your imagination and the natural world can merge together pretty seamlessly, so nothing seems strange to you when something unusual bursts onto the scene of your life. The bear man informed me in my head that a little girl called Haley wanted me to keep her doll, and had chosen me to watch over it and have it as my own. I remember thinking, what girl was he talking about? Because I didn't know anybody called Haley. And what doll was he referring to? But then the voice informed me that the doll was lying in a puddle on the road, and that Haley wanted me to retrieve the doll from the water and take it with me home so that I could watch over it. I remember looking at the puddles on the road, and one of them was glistening like silver tinsel, and so I found myself immediately drawn to the puddle, rather like iron filings to a magnet. That was when I physically observed a girl reflected in the puddle in the water, like a face in the mirror. At first I thought I was looking at myself, and then I realized I was looking at a girl who looked astonishingly like me. I was quite taken aback by her reflection. She wore her hair in 2 big blonde ponytails and had big blue eyes. She told me her doll was called Annabel. Her name was Haley, and that she had chosen me to take care of her doll. She said she was 6 years old. I took the doll from the puddle and brought her into the car with me. I could see she was very pretty, although she was extremely dirty. My mother was not remotely amused by my actions. She told me she'd take me to Canmore in the morning and buy me a lovely new doll if I would kindly dispose of the doll I was carrying and toss it back in the road where it belonged. The look of disgust on her face was tangible. Anyone would have thought I'd brought a piece of roadkill into the car with me. She claimed the doll stank to high heaven, and she didn't want the filthy thing in the car with us. My brother Sam also made a great deal of fun out of me, taunting me at every opportunity, telling me the doll that I was carrying was disgusting. But I knew the girl I'd seen in the puddle in the road wanted me to have charge over her doll, and I was going to keep my promise to her. And besides, I really did like the doll, and Haley had said she wanted me to keep her. She said she could rest now that I was watching over her doll, without worrying about her. She said where she was from she had another doll just like Annabel, but she didn't want to abandon her one on this side of life. I wasn't sure what she meant by that at the time. I told my mother I wanted to keep the doll, and that her name was Annabel. For reasons I cannot explain, I became very attached to Annabel, much more so than I have ever been towards any other doll I've owned before. It was almost as if Haley's passion for her doll had rubbed off on me. I told my mother very stubbornly that no, I was keeping this doll, and that all that was needed was for her to be cleaned up. It would seem the more my mother tried to persuade me to part with the doll, the more fiercely determined I became to keep her. When we arrived at the Birchwoods cabin, it was the prettiest place I'd ever seen in my entire life. It really was like something out of a fairy tale. Luckily by this time the incessant rain had stopped. The sun began to reveal itself through the clouds. There was a vaporous mist swirling around the snow-covered peaks of the mountains that made it look all the more mysterious and intriguing. I remember being completely spellbound by the dazzling scenery, and suddenly I was not so sad that I had come here after all. I had met a nice girl in a puddle called Haley. I had met the bear man, and I had a brand new doll, and now I was about to stay in this prepossessing cabin. There were tall, lofty trees stretching over a wide mountainous area, and the extensive, very beguiling hilly valley was covered in all kinds of alpine flowers of every imaginable colour. I had falsely assumed that coming to a place in the countryside would be rather boring, but even at 6 years old I was completely spellbound and mesmerised by those spectacular views, for I had never been to such a pretty place before. When we arrived at the cabin, a young woman, who is the age that I am now, came dashing out of the cabin. Her face was animated, and the way she looked at my mother was the way some teenagers look at pop idols, like when they meet Justin Timberlake for the very first time. I soon realised this young woman, whose name was Hilda McFreece, had been given charge over us, and would watch over us while my mother worked on her book. It turned out that Hilda was a big fan of my mother's work. She'd actually read a couple of my mother's novels, and thought my mother was some kind of movie star. She couldn't comprehend why my mother didn't flaunt her successes as a writer, and why she hid her name behind a pseudonym. I really did like Hilda McFreece, because I'd never met anyone like her before. She had a bubbly, effervescent personality, and was so humorous she made us laugh all the time. She taught us to bake, and she helped me and my brother with our lessons. One day she told us we were going for a picnic in the woods, and I asked her if I could help her prepare the stuff for our picnic, and she said yes, and so I did. We industriously packed a big picnic basket with all kinds of yummy treats that are very appealing to a 6-year-old palate, shall we say, from peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to gummy bears, chocolate chip cookies, sausage rolls, and bottles of Hilda's homemade lemonade. We carefully packed our picnic basket on the back of the Birchwood's 4-seater ATV, and Hilda drove us enthusiastically through the woods, down some of those long, windy paths that were very bumpy and rather precarious. I felt as if we were embarking on an exciting, intrepid adventure, as we whizzed past trees and over rocky inclines, and then finally we found the most perfect picnic spot for our picnic. It was beside a gushing stream, where water obstreperously marched over the jutting rocks, showering them with a foaming white discharge. There were overhanging trees that were brushing the surface of the water with their leafy green boughs. They looked like hunchback old men, dressed in green, searching the water for a lost coin. The first thing we did after Hilda parked her ATV under a tree was make a dash for the water, for we waited for no one. We could not get to the water fast enough. I eagerly threw off my shoes and socks, so they landed rather precariously on the bank, and then me and my brother began to paddle in the water, chasing after everything that moved. There were these tiny little silvery fish that swam past us at the speed of light, which we desperately tried to catch with our hands, with no success whatsoever. Our futile, somewhat pathetic attempts to snatch a fish made us giggle like crazy. The surface of the water shimmered, and for a brief moment I was certain I saw the little girl Haley on the surface of the water, smiling at me through her reflection. She was there one moment and gone the next, and I was sure I'd imagined her. I had left Annabelle, my doll, on the front seat of the ATV, because I thought she'd be safe there, as I took her everywhere I went. Me and my brother continued to play for a while, and when we realised there was no way we were going to catch a silver fish, we returned to the picnic. Hilda unrolled a large tartan picnic blanket and spread it across the ground. She began to open up various Tupperware containers of food, so we ate happily as we watched the water thundering over the rocks. It was so peaceful being by the stream and listening to the gushing sound of the water. I felt incredibly happy being in this beautiful place, surrounded by the cheerful trills of the bird song. Then it happened. My big desire to empty my bladder overcame me, and I told Hilda that I needed to go and pee-pee. "But you went before we came," said Hilda. "I made sure you went before we came, because I know what your bladder's like. Why do you need to go now? Is it urgent?" "Yes, it is. I've got to go," I said, clutching my dress to my abdomen, to warn Hilda that if she didn't let me go off now and find a tree to relieve myself behind, I'd go then and there all over the picnic. "She's always like this," my brother explained. "Laurie always needs to go in pee-pee." "Well, you better go then, hadn't you?" said Hilda. "Shall I come with you?" she asked me. "She's not a baby. She can go on her own," Sam interjected. "Well then go," said Hilda, "and please don't take long, or I'll worry about you. You're my responsibility, don't forget that." I hurried off to find a suitable tree, whereby I could relieve myself, but I felt annoyed with my bladder for showing me up yet again. It was humiliating always needing to go to the toilet like this, as if my entire life was dictated to by a very weak bladder that kept badly misbehaving. I found a suitable tree and proceeded to get on with business, and that was when I saw him. It was the bear man. I was so delighted to see him again, especially close up and personal like this. I was not remotely afraid of him, not even for a second, because growing up I collected all kinds of bears, and my largest, most beloved bear in my bedroom was bigger than I was. He was a black and white panda bear, and was my absolute favourite. My mother had purchased him when driving through a small town in Vermont, and there it was in the window. I pointed it to my mother and told her I really wanted it. My mother never normally gave in to my childlike whims, so what she did next surprised even me. She stopped the car, told me to stay there, and returned with this oversized panda bear that I absolutely loved. I remember her saying, "I don't know why I stopped to buy the panda for you, but I couldn't resist. I thought he was absolutely gorgeous. Would you believe it? The very nice man who owns the boutique told me he only put the panda bear in the window 2 minutes ago. So maybe it was meant to be yours, Laurie." Now here I was staring at the bear man in the flesh, who far outrivaled my very big panda at home, who compared to the bear man looked like a tiny teddy. The bear man was impressively big, in every sense of the word. So Herculean in size, he'd never have been able to walk through a front door straight, without crouching, and even the width of his rather robust body would have made such an endeavour a tight squeeze for him. At 6 years old, meeting the bear man was extremely exciting for me, as it would likely have been for any other girl my age, for I certainly didn't feel remotely uncomfortable in his presence. I guess if I'd been in my teenage years, my reaction to the bear man would be one more of fear than of fascination. But at 6 years old, seeing the bear man made me feel as if all my Christmases and birthdays had come at once. The bear man was indicating for me to follow him, and I began to giggle. He was making me laugh. I obediently followed him, even though my mother had drummed into me since I was old enough to understand the meaning of the word, not to go off with strangers at all. But the bear man was not a stranger to me at all. I saw him as a very good friend. I felt no hesitancy or doubt. I just followed him into the woods, not stopping to think for a single second about how upset Hilda or my brother Sam would become if I didn't return to our picnic. At 6, I lived in the moment, as kids that age so often do. I wanted to know exactly what the bear man had to show me. He picked me up and threw me onto his powerful shoulders, and I was delighted to be riding on his back, with a breeze blowing against my skin. I felt like a kid in the fairground, having the time of my life. I grabbed onto the bear man's hair like a horse's mane, and giggled like mad, as he sashayed through the woods, his nimble body almost floating over everything. The bear man smelt of pine needles and wood, and I loved his earthy scent. Looking back, I don't recall ever asking the bear man where we were going. I trusted him implicitly. My childlike instincts didn't doubt that he was a faithful friend. It was when we reached this beautiful tree, like no other in the wood grove, statuesque and tall, its verdant leafy boughs towering up into the sky, like a majestic church steeple. That was when the bear man put me down, very gently, as if I was as delicate as a porcelain doll. He spoke to me like he had done to me when I was relieving myself on that sequestered country road, where he told me I'd find my doll Annabel in a puddle, which I most certainly did, although at the time she was covered in mud and looked like something the dog had dragged in. It was on this road that I had seen a flash vision of a girl who looked just like me, who had told me her name was Haley. She had asked me to look after her doll, which I had done so faithfully since we had come to the Birchwoods cabin. I didn't know why Haley had appeared to me in a flash like that, on a puddle in a country road, but never once did I question the peculiarity of such an unorthodox meeting, as in my 6-year-old brain I didn't speculate about the weirdness of any given situation. The communication between me and the bear man remained completely telepathic and flowed so naturally. The bear man informed me that Haley had asked him to bring me to this place. So there we are. That is the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.